William stood in the center of the Windsor drawing room and began reading the exact words Diana had written about Camilla. Nobody in the room moved. Not the head of the Privy Purse, not the Chief of Staff, not King Charles. The silence that followed lasted long enough that several people present would later describe it as the longest moment of their professional lives. Camilla did not cry. She did not speak. She simply sat completely still while the voice of Diana's son carried his mother's words across a room that had not been prepared for them. What Diana had actually written, and what those specific words did to the woman sitting across that polished table, was something no palace briefing, no legal strategy, and no 30 years of carefully constructed public image had ever prepared her for. The air in the room held the weight of 3 decades of unfinished business, and every person present felt it settle upon them like a physical presence. The Windsor drawing room had been arranged the way it always was for serious internal meetings. The furniture had not been moved. The curtains had not been drawn. Nothing about the physical space suggested that what was about to happen inside it would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their professional lives. The late afternoon light fell across the polished surfaces in the familiar pattern of an ordinary day, offering no warning of the rupture that was about to occur. William had read the letter privately before he arrived. He had read it twice, standing alone in his study at Kensington Palace, and he had spent the better part of a sleepless night deciding not what to do with it. That decision had been made the moment the forensic authentication was complete, but precisely how to present it. He had decided, in the end, not to summarize, not to paraphrase, not to allow his solicitor or his private secretary to speak on his behalf. He had decided to read it aloud himself, in his own voice, in the room where the people who needed to hear it were sitting. William began with the first page, the legal framework, the property clauses, the formal language Diana had used when she wanted no ambiguity in her meaning. The head of the Privy Purse followed line by line, his reading glasses pushed forward on his nose, his breathing audible in the quiet of the room. Charles sat in the high-backed chair near the fireplace with his hands folded in his lap. Camilla stood near the window. Her Chief of Staff stood one step behind her left shoulder. The language of the first page was precise, architectural, the kind of language that leaves no space for interpretation because it was never intended to be interpreted, only enforced. It moved through the room like a measured current, each clause landing with the quiet authority of something that had been waiting a long time to be spoken aloud. William turned to the second page. The language shifted here, and the room felt it before anyone had consciously registered the change. The precise legal cadence of the first page gave way to something more direct, more personal. Diana had always known the difference between writing for a courtroom and writing for a person. On the second page, she had made a choice that no solicitor had advised her to make, and that no institutional filter had ever softened. She had written Camilla's name, not a title, not a reference. Her name, written in the same deep navy ink, in the same sharp cursive hand, with no prefacing clause and no diplomatic distance. William did not pause. He continued reading. Camilla did not move. She had been standing with her weight evenly distributed, her hands loosely at her sides, in the particular posture of someone who has spent decades learning how to occupy public space without giving anything away. That posture did not change, but something behind it did. The people in that room who knew Camilla well enough to read the difference between her public stillness and her private stillness understood immediately that these were not the same thing. Charles looked down at the carpet. The head of the Privy Purse placed his pen flat on the leather ledger in his lap and did not pick it up again. William reached the passage Diana had underlined twice near the bottom of the second sheet and read through it without altering his pace. Then he turned to the third page, and it was there, in the first 4 lines of the final sheet, that the room went entirely silent in a way that nobody in it had anticipated, and nobody who was present would ever fully describe in the years that followed. What Diana had written on that third page had not been written for a court. It had not been written for history. It had been written for one person in that room specifically, and that person already knew it. The legal cadence stopped entirely halfway through the final sheet. The sentence structure changed. The spacing between lines changed. Even the pressure of the pen against the vellum changed in a way that the forensic analyst had noted in her written report without comment, because it was not her place to comment, but which William had noticed immediately when he first read it alone in his study the night before. Diana had shifted registers deliberately. She had written the first 2 pages as a solicitor writes. She had written the third page as herself. She began by stating with complete clarity and no qualifying language that the woman who married Charles after her death was to receive nothing from her personal apartments at Kensington Palace. Not furniture, not correspondence, not the small private objects that accumulate across a life and carry the specific weight of a person's interior world. She used the phrase disposed of, not donated, not archived, not redistributed, disposed of. The word had been chosen with the same precision she had applied to every other line in the document. Then she left Camilla something. It was the only direct bequest in the entire letter, and it was this: 500 romance novels from Diana's private collection, each one annotated in the margins in her own handwriting, observations, reactions, underlinings, the kind of notes a person makes when they are reading alone and have no intention of anyone else ever seeing what they think. And alongside the books, a single bottle of gin with a handwritten note attached that read, "A toast to placing second." There was no legal weight to this bequest. It could not be enforced. It could not be contested. It existed entirely outside the jurisdiction of the Spencer Trust and the civil probate framework that governed the rest of the document. Diana had known that when she wrote it. She had included it anyway, not as a legal instrument, but as something that a court could never touch and that no palace operative could classify or contain. A private communication between two women who had never once spoken honestly to each other, delivered across nearly 3 decades of silence. William read through the bequest, the novels, the gin, the 4 words that had landed in the room like something dropped from a considerable height, and he paused, not long enough to be theatrical, long enough to be deliberate. But here is what nobody in that Windsor drawing room had known when William began reading. Camilla had been aware of this bequest since the spring of 2003, a woman who had been among Diana's closest confidants in the final years, a figure peripheral enough to the official record that her name had never appeared in any published account of that period, had told Camilla privately, over the course of a single conversation in a London restaurant, that Diana had left her something in a sealed document. She had not revealed the contents in full, but she had told Camilla enough. Enough that Camilla had spent more than 2 decades knowing that somewhere, in some form, Diana's voice was waiting. She had built her public life across those 2 decades with that knowledge sitting quietly beneath everything, every appearance, every carefully managed engagement, every gradual consolidation of her position inside the household. And in a Windsor drawing room, in the voice of Diana's son, it had finally arrived. There was one more thing on the 3rd page. Diana had written something else beneath the bequest, separated from the paragraph above it by a single line of empty space, a gap that on a page this precisely composed was not accidental. It was a question, not a legal clause, not a further instruction. A question written in the same deep navy ink, addressed to no institution and no trustee and no court, addressed to Camilla directly by name. Diana had asked her this: if the positions had been reversed, if it had been Camilla who was asked to leave, Camilla whose marriage had been described in official documents as irretrievably broken, Camilla whose public image had been reduced to a single defining narrative that she had spent years trying to correct and never fully could, would she have had the endurance to continue? It was not a cruel question. That was what made it so difficult to sit with. There was no sarcasm in it, no trace of the bitterness that the public had long assumed must exist between these two women. It was a question one person asks another when they have decided in some final and irreversible part of themselves to stop pretending the other person is simply an obstacle and acknowledge that they are, in fact, a human being facing their own version of an impossible situation. Diana had looked across the architecture of her own life, the surveillance, the isolation, the systematic dismantling of her credibility by an institution that had decided she was more useful as a problem to be managed than a person to be heard, and she had asked Camilla whether she would have survived it. It was the most intimate thing in the document. It was also the most devastating. Charles had been looking at the carpet when William read those lines. He did not raise his eyes. The head of the privy purse set his reading glasses down on top of the leather ledger and pressed 2 fingers briefly against his forehead in a gesture so small that only the person standing directly beside him would have noticed it. And Camilla, who had not moved from her position near the window since William began reading, who had maintained the particular external composure that nearly 3 decades of public life had made second nature, experienced in the space of approximately 4 seconds, something that the people in that room had never seen from her before and would not see again. Her eyes closed, not in the way a person closes their eyes when they are tired, bored, or when they are thinking, in the way a person closes their eyes when they have just been handed something they did not expect to feel and do not yet know what to do with. It lasted 4 seconds. Then she opened them again. The room remained silent. William folded the third page carefully back along its original crease, placed it on top of the other 2 sheets, and set them flat on the polished surface of the coffee table without a word. Camilla signed her name with a silver fountain pen she had taken from the writing desk near the window. The signature took approximately 4 seconds. She set the pen down without looking at it, walked to the private side door on the far left of the drawing room, and left without speaking. Her chief of staff followed. The door closed behind them with the particular quietness of a heavy door in a formal room, the kind of sound that is not a slam and not a click, but something in between that registers in the body before the mind has time to process it. The corridor outside the sovereign's drawing room at Windsor runs for a considerable length before it reaches the private staircase that descends to the internal courtyard. Camilla walked it at her usual pace, not faster, not slower. Her chief of staff kept 1 step behind and did not speak. 2 members of her close protection team fell into position without being signaled. The sequence was automatic, practiced, the kind of movement that happens when a person's body continues performing its professional function while the rest of them is somewhere entirely different. The car was waiting in the inner courtyard. She got in. The door closed. The vehicle cleared the security gate at Windsor and moved onto the road toward London. And for the entire duration of that journey, 45 minutes in light afternoon traffic, Camilla did not make a single telephone call. Not to her legal team, not to her private secretary, not to her son Tom, who by that point had almost certainly seen fragments of the story beginning to surface on his phone. She sat in the back seat of the car with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the window, and the only sound in the vehicle was the low frequency of the road beneath the wheels. Those who have spent long enough inside the orbit of the royal household learn to read the specific grammar of these silences. There is the silence of someone managing their composure for the journey home before allowing themselves to respond privately. There is the silence of someone calculating their next move. And there is a third kind of silence, rarer and in its own way more telling than either of the others. The silence of someone who has just encountered something they had been preparing for and discovered that the preparation had not been sufficient. The car pulled into the private entrance at Clarence's house. She went directly upstairs. Her personal secretary had arranged the evening schedule on the desk in her sitting room, correspondence that required a response, a briefing document for an engagement the following morning, a handwritten note from a charity patron she had agreed to support. The papers sat in their usual order. The desk lamp was on. The room was exactly as it always was at that hour. Camilla sat down in the chair by the window and looked out at the garden. What happened in the hours that followed was not dramatic. It was not announced. It did not generate a press release or a briefing note or any of the visible apparatus through which the palace typically communicates its decisions to the world. What happened was quieter than that and considerably more precise, and that precision was the point. Before 9 o'clock that same evening, Camilla's office had received a formal written request delivered through the internal household communication system on plain administrative letterhead in the measured language of routine institutional correspondence, asking for a complete inventory of all Spencer family items currently held in palace storage. The request specified a response deadline of 5 working days. It did not explain its origins. It did not need to. The first visible sign of what the letter had set in motion appeared on a Tuesday morning, noticed only by someone whose professional life depended on noticing such things. A researcher who had spent 6 years monitoring the official royal household website as part of her work for a prominent London-based monarchy archive logged on and found that a single phrase in the section describing Camilla's institutional role had been quietly amended overnight. The previous wording had included a reference to her office's administrative coordination across certain household functions. The new wording did not. The paragraph was otherwise identical. The page carried no update timestamp. There was no accompanying announcement. If she had not been the kind of person who read that page with the specific attention of someone whose livelihood depended on catching exactly this kind of detail, she would not have seen it at all. She noted it in her private research log and said nothing publicly. Not yet. The second change was physical and more deliberate. A set of sapphire pieces from the Spencer collection, a necklace and matching earrings that Camilla had worn at 2 separate engagements over the preceding year, and which had appeared in widely circulated photographs on both occasions, were quietly removed removed from the palace vault by a member of the Spencer family's private legal representative and transported to Althorpe House on a Wednesday morning. The transfer was logged internally. No press notice was issued. The items simply ceased to be where they had been, and the space they left behind in the inventory was filled with administrative paperwork that confirmed the return of a loan rather than the removal of anything belonging to anyone currently residing in the household. The third change took longer to surface, but it was in some ways the most legible of all to those who understood the internal language of royal protocol. A formal guest list for an upcoming private engagement, the kind of list that circulates through household offices weeks in advance and is revised multiple times before it reaches its final version, was returned to Camilla's office with a single amendment. Her name appeared in the third position, not the second. The second position was occupied by William's name, placed there without explanation or accompanying correspondence, as though the arrangement had always been intended and required no comment. Her chief of staff reviewed the amended list for a long moment and then placed it in the outgoing tray without responding. Taken individually, none of these changes constituted an event. A phrase adjusted on a web page, a set of jewelry returned to its legal owner, a name moved one position down a guest list. Each one was, on its own, entirely explicable by routine administrative process. Each one could be attributed, if anyone chose to attribute it, to scheduling, logistics, legal tidiness, or standard household management. But the people who lived and worked inside the orbit of the royal household were not required to take them individually. They had spent careers learning to read the accumulation of small adjustments the way a navigator reads weather, not from any single sign, but from the pattern that emerges when enough signs appear in close enough succession. The pattern was clear. What Diana had set in motion with 3 handwritten pages was not a scandal, it was a recalibration. And recalibrations of this kind, inside an institution as practiced as this one, do not announce themselves. They simply become the new reality before most people realize the old one has ended. Charles did not go to Clarence House immediately. Those who tracked his movements that evening noted that he remained inside Windsor for considerably longer than the meeting required. The sovereign's drawing room had been empty for more than an hour before his personal protection officer logged the departure. What he did in that intervening time was not recorded. The room offered no account of itself, but people who had observed Charles across decades of private pressure understood that he processed difficult things slowly and alone, and that the version of him who emerged from that processing was always quieter and more deliberate than the one who had entered it. He arrived at Clarence House after dark. He did not bring his private secretary. He did not bring a legal advisor or a member of his household staff. He went upstairs directly to Camilla's sitting room and closed the door behind him. The 2 protection teams positioned in the corridor outside operated on the standing instruction that applied to all private conversations between senior members of the household, which was to say they heard nothing and logged nothing beyond the time of arrival and the time of departure. What is known comes from the residue that private conversations leave in the behavior of the people who have them. Camilla appeared at a scheduled public engagement the following morning. She was composed, punctual, and gave no indication in her expression or her manner that the previous 24 hours had been anything other than routine. Those who had known her for a long time and watched her closely noted only one small deviation from her usual presence. She did not wear jewelry that morning, not the absence of a specific piece, simply no jewelry at all, where there was almost always something. A strand of pearls, a brooch, a bracelet. The choice registered with the people who noticed these things and was not explained by anyone. Charles had told her something the previous evening that caused her to make that choice. Nobody present could confirm what it was, but the most credible account assembled from people adjacent to both households in the weeks that followed suggested that the conversation had contained something neither of them had ever discussed directly in nearly 3 decades together. Charles had told her that he had known a document existed, not its contents, not its location, but its existence. The fact that Diana, in the final weeks of her life, had executed something formal and private and placed it outside the reach of the palace had been known to him since the early years of their marriage. He had been told by a member of his own legal team who had encountered a reference to it in the course of reviewing Diana's estate correspondence. He had made a decision at that time not to search for it. He had believed, and had continued to believe across more than 2 decades, that time would render it irrelevant. He had been wrong. Camilla listened to this without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for long enough that Charles felt felt the need to say something further and found that he had nothing further to say. She did not ask him why he had not told her. Perhaps because she already understood the answer. Perhaps because after everything that had been said in that Windsor drawing room, there was a version of honesty between them that no longer required the question to be spoken aloud. He left before midnight. The corridor outside was silent. The story did not break through an official channel. It never does with this family. It moved instead through the connective tissue that surrounds any institution of sufficient size and age, the assistants and drivers and junior correspondents and retired advisors who each possess one fragment of a larger picture and none of whom can see the whole of it from where they stand. The cancelled television interview had been the first visible thread. By the time journalists began pulling it seriously, the shape of what lay beneath had already started to emerge in outline. Diana's name appeared in print by early afternoon. The word letter followed within the hour. By early evening, the phrase hidden document was moving faster than any press office could contain, and the palace had issued a statement of 4 sentences that confirmed nothing and satisfied no one, and was understood by every experienced royal correspondent to mean precisely the opposite of what it said. 3 major newspapers ran 3 entirely different stories the following morning. The first positioned William as the rightful enforcer of a mother's documented wishes, a son who had waited for the appropriate moment and acted with the kind of precision that Diana herself would have recognized and approved of. The second asked, with the particular careful phrasing of a broadsheet uncomfortable with its own question, whether deploying the private words of a woman dead for nearly 3 decades served the dignity of anyone involved, including hers. The third focused almost entirely on Camilla, not as villain, not as victim, but as a woman who had spent the better part of her adult life being defined by a narrative she had never been permitted to fully contest, and who was now being defined by one again. None of the 3 was entirely wrong. That was what made the public conversation so difficult to resolve. On social media, the phrase "placing second" traveled with a velocity that no communications team could have anticipated and no algorithm needed to amplify. It required no context. It required no explanation of the legal framework or the Spencer Trust structure or the forensic authentication process. It contained, in 3 words, the entire architecture of a 30-year story, and people who had never read a single line about the royal household understood instinctively what it meant and why it had been written. A royal historian of considerable standing appeared on evening television and stopped mid-sentence while answering a question that had not been particularly difficult. He set down his notes, looked directly at the camera, and said that in 30 years of studying this institution, he had never encountered a private legal document activated in precisely this manner. His interviewer did not know how to respond. The segment ran considerably longer than scheduled. From Australia, from Canada, from the United States, from every country that had watched Diana's funeral on a television screen in September of 1997 and had never entirely released the grief of it, the reaction was not legal or constitutional or analytical. It was the reaction of people who had carried something for a long time and had just been told, without warning, that the person they had carried it for had been carrying something too. She had known what was coming. She had prepared for it. She had left a record, and the record had spoken. The basement vault at Althorpe was empty now. The steel table where the leather writing case had rested for nearly 3 decades stood bare beneath the bare bulb of the ceiling light. The climate-controlled air that had preserved the vellum pages across all those years still hummed quietly through the vents, maintaining the precise temperature and humidity specifications that had been set when the room was first commissioned, continuing its function faithfully long after the thing it had been protecting was gone. There was nothing left to find in that room. There had not been for weeks. What remained was distributed across 3 separate locations. The original vellum pages sat in the Spencer family's formal legal archive, catalogued under a reference number known only to the trustees. The gold polo mallet charm rested in a small conservation case beside them, and the forensic authentication report prepared by the Scotland Yard analyst, the document that had collapsed Camilla's legal defense before sunrise on the morning after the Windsor meeting, was filed in the secure records of William's private solicitor, where it would remain for as long as it needed to. The story, by the time the garden party photographs had been filed and the newspaper debates had run their course and the television historians had said everything they could think of to say, had settled into the particular stillness that follows events of this kind. Not resolution, not closure. The specific quiet of something that has been absorbed by an institution, practiced at absorbing things, and will not be discussed again in any official capacity for a very long time. But absorption is not the same as erasure. Camilla retained her title. She retained her public position. She continued to appear at engagements and fulfill the obligations of her role with the professionalism that had characterized her public life for decades. What she no longer retained was the administrative momentum her office had been quietly accumulating, the slow, patient expansion of institutional footprint that most people outside the household had never noticed and would not have been able to name even if they had. That expansion had been stopped. The stopping of it had been witnessed by every senior figure inside the household. And in that world, witnessed consequences require no further commentary. William had not done this in anger. He had not done it in grief or in the spirit of settling scores on behalf of a mother the institution had wronged. He had done it because a legal boundary existed, because it had been constructed specifically to be enforced at exactly this kind of moment, and because he was now the person with the standing to enforce it. The distinction mattered to him. It was, in a way that he would never articulate publicly, the distinction his mother had designed the entire document around. Charles had protected the monarchy. He had absorbed the crisis without allowing it to rupture publicly, had made the necessary institutional decisions with the speed and decisiveness that the situation required, and had done so at a personal cost that no official record would acknowledge and no public statement would ever reference. He had chosen the institution over his wife, as the institution had always required its kings to do, and he had done it in a room with a polished coffee table and pale spring light coming through Gothic windows, and his son standing in the center of it, holding 3 pages of navy blue ink. And Diana had written those pages in August of 1997, in a private house on Spencer Land, beyond the reach of the Royal Archives and the Lord Chamberlain's office, and every institutional mechanism that had spent 15 years trying to manage what she said and when she said it, and to whom. She had written them before the internet existed, before William was old enough to understand what she was building, before anyone inside the palace had seriously considered the possibility that she was thinking that far ahead. She had always been thinking that far ahead. They had simply never been paying close enough attention.